So in the last video, we talked about what happens if prices go up. What if they go up to 100? Well, how much do we produce? Well, we still produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, right? We also talked about, well, what happens if prices fall? Well, we just produce less because we're still going to produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So, if prices continuously fall or begin to fall and they keep falling, at what point does a firm begin to break even, where they make just enough money, to cover their costs? They make zero profit, but they're not losing any money either. When does that occur? At what point does that occur? Also, at what point does a business shut down in the short run? When are they going to shut down in the short run because they're suffering too much losses? Well, we're going to talk about that. We're going to identify a couple of key points on this chart, on this graph, that talk about the break-even point. So the break-even point is equal to the average, is the point where the average total cost equals the average revenue. That makes sense. The average revenue is the revenue that you receive per unit. The total cost is the total cost per unit of output. So average revenue, what is the price you're receiving per unit of output? Total cost is the cost it's costing you to produce per unit of output. So if they're equal to each other, if it's costing you, say it's costing you $45 to produce and you receive $45, well, how much are you making? What's your profit? Well, it's zero. So if the amount that they make per unit, so the revenue per unit equals the amount that it costs them to make per unit, that's the break-even point. So where does that occur on this graph? Well, we could draw any number of average revenue curves on this graph, and we could say, all right, well, here's where average revenue equals total cost, because remember our average revenue curve is the same thing as our marginal revenue curve in the perfect competition. So these two are equal, but are we producing there? No. Remember that MR equals MC. We have to produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So we're actually producing out here. So if we're producing at this point, our marginal revenue is here, our marginal cost is there, our average total cost is way down here. And the place in between, that's all your profit. So we're not going to be producing that. We're not really worried about that over there. We need to actually be following this marginal revenue curve down. So we know that we can draw infinite number of marginal revenues, and they're all going to be parallel, and they can all just kind of stair step down. So if we keep following this marginal cost curve down, it's actually going to be at that point where the marginal cost curve crosses the average total cost curve. So it's right there at that point. So if I were to draw out our marginal revenue curve, let's say that the prices fell from this $45 down to this point where the the marginal cost curve crosses across that average total cost. Well, we're going to be producing right there where that marginal revenue equals marginal cost, but it's also at the minimum point of the average total cost curve too. Remember from before I said that the marginal cost curve is going to cross the average total cost at their minimum point. So at this point right here is where marginal revenue equals average revenue, which equals average total cost, which equals marginal cost. All four of those deals are equaling each other at this point. So we know by default that where the marginal cost curve crosses the average total cost curve, or where they are equal to each other, where they cross those same lines, that point, that's actually break-even point. Because it's at this point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. We're sufficing that. We're still making sure that holds true. But it's also at this point where the marginal cost or the price is equal to the average total cost, or that average revenue is equal to that average total cost. So all of those conditions are meeting. So we know that the point where the average total cost curve equals the marginal cost curve is the break-even point. So now, where's the shutdown point? Well, the shutdown point, it's actually going to be where the average variable cost equals the average revenue. So the reason why it's at that point, the average variable cost, remember those are your variable inputs. That's your labor. That's that fuel in that tractor. If you shut down right then if you shut down, what happens to your variable costs? Well, they go to zero. If you're not producing anything, your variable costs are going to go to zero. But what happens to your fixed costs? Well, your fixed costs actually remain the same. So this shutdown point is actually going to be where this average variable cost equals the average revenue. At this point where this average variable cost, which is this red line, equals that marginal cost curve, and it's going to hold that same principle as before. At this particular point, right here, at that point, the firm is still able to cover all of their variable costs. They can cover all of their variable costs, and if they're but none of their fixed costs. They cannot cover any of their fixed costs. So basically, at this point, they can pay their employees for labor, but they can't pay their property taxes. If the average variable cost equals that average revenue, they can still pay to keep people employed. They can still pay for that fuel. They can still cover all of their variable costs, but none of their fixed costs. And you remember, as before, that marginal revenue must equal marginal cost. So we actually draw this marginal revenue. We keep moving this marginal revenue curve down, and it actually crosses where that marginal cost crosses that average variable cost curve is right around this point. That's going to be our shutdown point. So our even though it says break even, our shutdown point is where marginal cost equals average variable cost. So the thing to keep in mind is the break even point is where average total cost equals marginal cost, which also equals where the marginal revenue would be at. The break even or the shutdown point is where marginal cost equals average variable cost. So what if you're in between the shutdown point and the break-even point? What if you're in between those two? If you're in between those two, firms will continue to operate at a loss in the short run. Well, does that make much sense? Is a business going to continue to operate at a loss? Why would they operate at a loss? Well, here's why. If they shut down right then and there, if a firm is taking a loss, but it's in between the break-even and the shutdown point, they can cover all of their variable costs and still some of their fixed costs if they're in between the break-even and the shutdown point. So let me put up this break-even. The break-even point is at that intersection right there. Versus the shutdown point is at that intersection right there. So if they're operating somewhere within those two prices, somewhere within that price range, if the price is somewhere in between there, they are able to cover all of their variable costs and can still cover some of their fixed costs. So they're minimizing their fixed cost bill, or they're minimizing their losses. Well, what if they shut down? Well, their variable cost goes to zero, right? But what happens to their fixed cost? Does it go away? Not in the short run. Your fixed costs are still there. So if they're operating at a loss in the short run, they keep operating because they can still cover all of their variable and still cover some of their fixed costs. Well, what if their fixed cost was $100 a month and their variable cost was, say, $20, and they're receiving, let's say, a revenue of $40, for example. So they're covering all of their variable costs, and they still have $20 left over to cover part of their fixed costs. So now their fixed cost bill, instead of taking a loss of $100, they're taking a loss of $80. You continue to operate in the short run, in between the shutdown point and the break-even point, because, well, frankly, you're covering some of your fixed costs. But what if the price falls below the shutdown point? Why do you shut down right then and there instead of continuing to operate? Let's use that same example. Let's say fixed costs are $100, variable costs are $20, and then the price is $10. Well, if you continue to operate, not only are you covering all of your fixed costs, but now you're incurring a loss, or not only taking a loss on all of your fixed costs, but you're also taking a loss because you're paying your variable cost of $20 and you're receiving only $10 in revenue, to where now you're paying $10, you're taking a loss of $10 on your variable cost as well. Whereas if you shut down, you go to a $0 on zero variable cost, but you're still paying your fixed cost of $100. Well, that's still a lot better than paying $110 in losses every single time.